right, so for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about a situation called crisis, and that most of us probably at some point or other have experienced in our life, and then ways to intervene. Uh, when we think about nursing, the people that we take care of in EDs, in cancer units, in psychiatric facilities may have come in because they were in a crisis situation, right? Um, or their diagnosis has put them in a crisis situation. So as nurses, we need to know how to help people when they are feeling basically overwhelmed by life. So one way of thinking about what it is like for this individual who's feeling overwhelmed is to think about what crises you might have experienced in your life. Was it perhaps loss of a loved one, an illness? Um, we had floods a couple years ago. Perhaps some of you were impacted by those. The hurricane last year. I tend to think about as a way of bringing this to light is to think about 9/11, because when I think back on 9/11, I think about a country in crisis during that time. Uh, Certainly what we experienced in South Carolina was very, very different than what was being experienced in Washington, D.C., or in Pennsylvania, or in New York City. I'm certainly not going to downplay that, but there was this sense of what is going to happen, and feeling perhaps overwhelmed with fear of what was going to happen next, right? Um, During that time of crisis that maybe you've identified, or maybe you're thinking back on 9/11 that day. I know some of you are maybe too young to even have been, um, you know, aware of what was happening at that point in time, and only learned about it in the history books. I know that's happening now, but uh, I can remember it like it happened yesterday. It's just one of those kind of events in your life that you kind of have like snapshots of in your memory, and how fearful it was. I remember being afraid, being shocked. I remember feeling like I was here at the college when the news came out, and just wanting to actually just go home and get my children from school and just go to our house and just be together. Uh, so a sense of vulnerability, perhaps anxiety comes with it. And so what did you do during your time of crisis? Did you reach out to others? Did you pray? Uh, uh, what did you do? What actions did you take? Did you feel that you were in danger? And certainly would depend on the crisis situation, whether that was part of the picture. Did you discuss your situation with anyone? If yes, with whom did you? I mean, who was your first thought to call, perhaps? What did you do to cope with the emotions? Did you cry? Did you pray? Did you go out for a walk, listen to music? What did you do? Can you identify the coping mechanisms that worked best for you during that time? So the definition of crisis is as a sudden event in one's life that disturbs homeostasis. So this is a time when the world seems upside down, so very different than what we usually think about our world as being. And during that time of being overwhelmed or feeling topsy-turvy, the usual coping mechanisms that we used in the past just don't work. For some people, this becomes a turning point. A crisis can be a turning point for good, for growth as an individual, Also, it could be in some circumstances a time where they might, their health, mental health, might actually suffer and go downhill. All right, so here is a concept map of crisis resolution. So, you know, how do people resolve it? How does people work through the situation? So you have the crisis. As a result of the crisis, you feel anxious. Again, as we talked about in a previous lecture on anxiety, the usual coping methods that you tend to want to use when you're feeling upset and anxious, you try, but they just don't work. They just are inadequate. And at that point in time, then we have two possible roads that could occur. The person could go down. One, and this is based on interventions and coping, all right? Powerlessness, helplessness, paralysis might be one road. And then as a result of that, the person's anxiety actually increases to the point that their personality may actually experience disorganization. It might become psychotic. All right, on the other hand, another road that with intervention and assistance the person might be able to take is that they might end up developing new coping skills. And as a result of that, their anxiety is decreased and they return to pre-crisis functioning. All right, so there have been three types of crisis that have been identified. They're maturational, situational, and adventitious. Your book talks about the three of these. Maturational has to do with development. So maturational crisis may be unplanned pregnancy. All right. Situational is something that can happens kind of out of the ordinary in everyday life. All right. To the individual, but not so it's such a real extraordinary event, not, you know, kind of ordinary, but not to the individual, such as a divorce, right, or a move, or retirement. Which, well, retirement, we'll go back up here, would be more maturational. So sometimes people do experience crisis when they haven't planned for retirement, right? So again, retirement, maturational, unexpected pregnancy, maturational, divorce would be situational. A move, perhaps, would be situational. Loss of a job, situational. Then we have the adventitious, which are outside the norms of everyday living. And so that would be 9/11, would be an example of an adventitious. Major hurricanes, earthquakes, examples of adventitious crisis. All right, when a person is in a crisis situation, they tend to go through different phases in relation to what they're experiencing. And this was outlined by Lindemann, who looked at, there were, back in, like, I think it was the 40s, it was the Coconut Grove fire. It's a nightclub that the place caught on fire. It was crowded, it was packed, and the door, the back door to the nightclub was blocked, and so there was only one way out of this nightclub. And with this fire, then that got blocked, and there's about 500 people that died as a result of this disaster, which would be considered an adventitious experience. And as a result of that, Lindemann started to think about the people that were left behind. And he believed that preventive intervention could decrease serious reactions to traumatic events. And so he and Kaplan and all, you might hear, did, were people that did a lot of work around this issue of crisis, so you'll hear them talked about before. Um, you'll hear, too, in the nursing literature about Aguilera and Mesnick. These were nurses who developed assessments and interventions also for crisis. I heard Aguilera speak one time at a conference, and she was excellent. But she's done a lot of research, and when you look at the literature related to crisis, you're going to see some of her work. She's done a lot of articles and all on it. All right, so Kaplan Lindemann developed these phases of crisis. So you have that exposure to the precipitating event, and this threat, as a result, causes disequilibrium and anxiety. And then usual coping mechanisms are employed, what we tend to do as human beings. Phase 2, we see an increase in anxiety because what we have tried just isn't working. There's ineffective problem solving. So previous problem solving techniques don't relieve the stressor, so anxiety increases, the individual begins to feel helpless and unable to cope. Trial and error attempts at problem solving and restoring normal balance begin. So what they usually do isn't working, so they're going to try other things. All right, so and phase 3, activation of all resources. The individual may try to view problem from a different perspective. New problem-solving techniques may be used. If ineffective, then their anxiety will continue to increase. If effective, crisis resolution may occur. And so what you would see is with intervention that in these first 3 phases, that's where intervention should occur, because you don't want the person to go to phase 4, which is major disorganization, or they become panicked and disordered and with labile emotions, and so the possibility is of violence or suicide during this time. You might see them become psychotic. All right. Now, as we assess people in crisis and take a look at what it can help somebody in crisis, there are 3 balancing factors. I would highlight this, know this. This is developed by Aguilera. All right, and as part of our assessment of people that are in crisis, you would look for these 3 balancing factors. All right. So look at this. What is their perception of the precipitating event? So down here, how much support do they have, and what are their coping mechanisms in place? All right. And this is interesting when you think about crisis intervention, is that you need to think about it and assess it from a cultural standpoint too, because many cultures during crisis situation, they will band together and come and be of major assistance to people that are in the crisis state. So what might work for one group of people might not work for another as far as help. And the reason I bring this up is I remember reading that during 9/11 they had all these crisis teams available for people to use, and it's not that people didn't need support. Some came, but what they realized was that people were using each other, right? They didn't. And some needed that extra support, but others had what they needed in their own support systems. They had a big enough support system to assist them. All right, so coping. So the 3 balancing factors: individuals' perception of the event, the amount of support that they have, and coping mechanisms that they have in place. So if their perception of the event is realistic, okay, this is a hard, bad thing that happened, but we can get through it. Okay, it's realistic. Not that it's the end of the world and the apocalypse is upon us kind of thing. if their support is adequate and their coping mechanisms are effective, problem is resolved, and they don't tend to go into crisis, or they come out, it's alleviated in maybe phase 1 or 2. All right, but if they have an unrealistic view of the event, again, maybe the apocalypse is upon us, the inadequate support and ineffective coping, then the problem is unresolved, and the person does go into a crisis state. So we assess when people are feeling overwhelmed. One of our roles as a nurse is to assess for those 3 balancing factors, and to help the person get into a state of balance from their disequilibrium. All right, common characteristics. So occurs in all individuals at some point. It's not necessarily associated with psychopathology, even though our mentally ill patients are certainly at risk for crisis. Right? But the assumption is that when we work with people, that they came into it as in a mentally healthy state. Crises are personal. What one person perceives as a crisis, another may not. Crises are always acute. So highlight that in your notes. Always acute, not chronic. They usually last for maybe 4 to 8 weeks, and it's done. All right? We don't take care of people that are in chronic crisis. A crisis situation is an opportunity for personal growth or possibility of deterioration. So the goal is certainly that we would bring that person back to baseline, and our hope is that they would grow as an individual, learn something from the event that can help them to grow. All right, so intervention, crisis intervention. We want to first off decrease their anxiety. We don't want it to escalate. We are going to maintain their safety from hurting themselves or hurting other people. We're going to activate their social support system, so we talk to them about who we might be able to call for them. And our goal here again is to restore client to pre-crisis functioning. So what was our baseline before this all happened? That's the goal, to restore them to that level of functioning. All right. So this is another crisis intervention model by Roberts, where we look at psychosocial and lethality assessments. That's part of it. We rapidly have to establish rapport and relationship with the individual. We don't have a whole lot of time, right? We got to intervene and get this person stabilized quickly. We try to identify what the patient's major problems or precipitants was. And the important thing here is to identify what was the precipitant. All right, so say somebody shows up at a ED in a crisis, overwhelmed state, and they tell you that they've been having some marital issues, undergoing breast cancer treatment, and today their daughter told them that she was pregnant and unexpectedly, and would have to leave college. All right. So the precipitant to that crisis state would be the news from the daughter, not the previous issues of marital discord and a cancer diagnosis. Right. Even though those would be major problems. But it's when you're thinking about helping somebody in crisis, you want to know what was the straw that broke the camel's back. Deal with feelings and emotions that they're experiencing, generate and explore alternatives, implement an action plan, and follow up. All right. With crisis intervention, it's directed toward 3 levels of care. So we want to do primary prevention, secondary intervention, or tertiary. So primary is prevention by teaching coping strategies, evaluating potential impact of life events. So the person goes into overwhelming events with a huge toolkit of possibilities to assist themselves. Secondaries intervening to prevent prolonged anxiety and ensure safety of a client during a crisis. And so this might be your rape victim, say, that is coming into the ED after reporting an assault. Tertiary is intervening with those recovering from severe crisis and are in a disabling mental condition. All right. One of the things that I want to talk to you just briefly about is a disaster. All right. So disaster, sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or society and causes human, material, economic, or environmental losses that exceed the community's or social society's ability to cope using its own resources. So this is, we're talking about a situation that impacts many, many people, such as Hurricane Katrina. An occurrence that has resulted in property damage, deaths, and or injuries to a community. So think about the flood a couple years ago that went through Columbia and South Carolina, all right, where we had, I think we lost like 17 people, still recovering from property damage. All right, so your book talks about disaster management as being prepared, figuring out what you need to do to be prepared. Put into place mitigating or helpful circumstances or, well, for instance, part of preparedness would be to think about with a hurricane that we would have people coming from the coast, and we need to be prepared for mass exodus. So mitigating that would be to turn the interstates into one way, all lanes going one way, which they did with Hurricane Matthew. Then we have a response, and then the recovery. And here is, I found this when we were going through the flood. And the flood in Columbia impacted me very mildly, really, when I look at it from others. We didn't have any kind of property damage, but people like a mile away from us lost their homes. We were without water for several days. That wasn't fun, but in the whole scheme of things, not a disaster, a big, horrible thing. All right, so we have the warning. So we knew, for instance, the flood. They were telling us several days beforehand that this storm was coming. All right, so then there was the impact of the storm. All right, and then remember with the flood, how we saw all these stories on TV about how people were gathering together and bringing canoes and boats and going out and rescuing people from rooftops. Yep. And then you have that, so that's that heroic phase. And then there's a honeymoon phase where there's a lot of community cohesion, so people getting together and going and helping people, bringing them warm meals and giving them a place to stay and helping them clean up their houses. That was that community cohesion. And then there's a period of disillusionment when people were concerned that they weren't getting the help that they needed from the government, from FEMA, and the money, and figuring out how to well, think about it with a flood, and this is something I never thought of until this happened, that these people lost their homes, that they still had mortgages on, all right? And that because their house wasn't there anymore or was, ruined, did not negate the fact that they still had to pay their mortgage. So they had to find a place to stay, pay for another place to stay, and still continue to pay their mortgage, all right? So it was a very rough time, okay? So coming to terms, working through grief, all right? And so there's still, I go through some of the little streets near where I live, and I still see some homes that have been they're abandoned. I see homes that are being torn down, and I see some rebuilding going on. So that's that new beginning. All right. So, but that takes a long time. So people, even though that was a couple years ago, people are still struggling with that. All right. All right, so this is, again, going through that, just what we talked about. All right. Okay. Now, with crisis intervention, we also have a situation where we could do critical incident debriefing, and this is a tertiary group approach. So it's with people, a group of people, and this is not for people that have been through crisis, an individual person. This is for a group. It's a group approach, and it's usually used for people that have been helping other people in crisis. So it might be your firefighters, your police officers, your ED staff, say, all right, that are struggling with the horrors, perhaps, of what they saw, all right, and maybe having some symptoms as a result of that. And so, and this is supposed to be a voluntary approach where the group is brought together and is very structured. They have an introductory phase of the group where they talk about what the group is about. They talk about the facts of what they went through so people can share the facts of the situation. The thought phase. All right, what were they thinking when they went into that burning building, say if they were firefighters, and maybe it might have been a burning building where children were lost. Okay, that's a very difficult situation. So what were they thinking? What was their reaction? Afterwards, what were their symptoms? Okay, are they having problems sleeping, or they continue to re-experience the event? Then you have a teaching phase where some information is given on how to cope at this point in time. And then the reentry phase. So after they've done all this, then, and it's not to say that it's done for everybody. This might be enough, right? Or they might need some further help. And so the reentry might include being given other types of resources that might be beneficial. But remember, this is not something that is done for individuals. This is done for certain groups and is voluntary. Okay. Crisis counseling, this is usually a very brief solution-focused therapy, maybe 5 to 6 sessions, again, to help the person to talk through the event if they want to. Now, this doesn't necessarily help everyone, okay? Everyone doesn't benefit from this. Active listening, encouraging open expression of feelings, exploring new ways of coping are important techniques that may be used. Helps client to gradually accept reality. And again, depends on how much trauma the individual experienced. They might need something different than this type of approach. Focuses on the client's strengths, not their pathology. So, even though they're having difficulty coping, we still, even coming for help can be a focus. That's a strength when somebody reaches out. All right, so as nurses, we need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. Dealing with people in crisis is hard, right? And it can result in the nurse feeling anxious, frustrated, angry, and apprehensive. Existential issues may arise. And this means that during this time, of dealing maybe with so many crises, that the nurse reevaluates their purpose in life and are they where they want to be in their life, doing what they think they were put here on earth to do. Okay. Empathy and flexibility are critical, but develop realistic expectations about what you can do for others. So we have to know how much, when to stop. All right. When we don't want to do for the person what they can do for themselves, and we might have to be a little bit more directive initially with the individual in crisis, calling people for them, um, just being more directive. Be aware of impact on yourself of repeatedly hearing horrible stories. So we have to have good things in our life in order to be able to cope with the things that we encounter or hear about. Respect and believe in a person's capacity to grow and change. You need to be open to supervision as needed, to be able to go and talk to somebody about that maybe is more experienced about what you're experiencing. Being aware of your own symptoms of stress and crisis. Make sure that you have, and now, this is why we talk about this in nursing school, is so you start now incorporating stress management into your life. So some of the things that we talked about the other day. Are you taking care of yourself? What self-care strategies do you have in place? Cultivate your own support system. What they say is the larger your support system, the better off you are. Okay, and support system, you know, positive support. All right, so this concludes this discussion of crisis and crisis intervention. We went through what it is, in that period of being overwhelmed, and how, and the stages that people go through. Remember to look at those assessment of the person in crisis, and remember to think about the balancing factors and think about the precipitating event. Also be very, very important as we assess people to make sure that we assess for suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, and making sure that they are not using maladaptive coping such as alcohol and too much alcohol and drinking. All right. And then we looked at some disaster issues, and thinking then about the taking care of yourself after dealing with people in crisis. All right, if you have any questions or concerns about this content, please let me know.